we're going to carry on today. This time we are going to be looking at the den. Obviously, last time we know that the children were fast asleep, have managed to get to sleep after they had run further into the forest trying to hide from a snake. The den. It was ferociously hot, and he was still alive. Those were the thoughts that came to Fred as he opened his eyes and found himself staring straight up at the Brazilian sun. Instinctively, he looked down at his wristwatch, but the face was cracked and the minute hand had fallen off. The two girls were asleep next to him. Both of them were covered in blood and scabs, but they were breathing easily. Con had her thumb in her mouth. There was a host of dragonflies in luminous blues and reds dancing around them. He thought they might be attracted to the blood. But there was no sign of the little boy. Max was missing. "Max!" Fred whispered, jumping to his feet. There was no answer, no movement, except the burr of dragonfly wings. Fred's heart started to pound. "Max!" he called louder. Leela stirred in her sleep. He ran to the edge of the trees. There was no trace of the boy. "Max!" he roared, staring wildly around. "What?" Max looked up. He was lying on his stomach behind some fern-like plants next to the vile-smelling puddle, plashing his fingers in the water. "Max!" Fred ran over to him, wincing as one of his ribs protested sharply. "You haven't been drinking that water, have you?" Max stared up at Fred as he approached, then screwed his eyes shut and let out a scream that shook the baby flesh in his cheeks. Across the clearing, Leela gave a yell as she startled awake. "That's not very flattering," said Fred to Max. But it was possible. He reckoned that covered in blood and soot, and with less eyebrow than usual, he didn't look very reassuring. The boy kept screaming, barely drawing breath. Leela jumped to her feet. "Max!" she called. "What's happened?" Sugar, Fred thought. He knew that you should give people sugar for shock. "Do you want a sweet?" He had some mint humbugs in his pocket. "Please stop crying." He fished the sweets out of his pocket. His hand came out wet. There was a cut on his thigh and half-dry blood in his pocket, and the mints had spent the night marinating in it. He grimaced and put one in his mouth. The taste hadn't been improved, but the sugar gave his blood a twitch. "Do you want one of these?" Fred spat on a corner of his shirt and polished it unclean. "It's a mint." "Ugh, no, I hate mints," said Max. "It's the only food I've got." "Oh, then I guess I'll take it," said Max. He said it like a lord accepting a peasant's bread. "Here," said Fred. He put it in the boy's sticky hand. "Eat it slowly if you can." Max sucked loudly. His nose began to run down past his lips and onto his chin. "Max!" Leela called. "Come here." "Come on," said Fred. The boy's face was intent on working on the mint, his eyebrows furrowed in concentration. He looked very breakable. Fred felt his chest tighten, but he said only, "You should probably blow your nose." "I don't blow my nose," Max said. They walked both limping towards Leela. "It's not a thing I do." "I think you should." "No." Max licked the snot off his upper lip and added it to his mouthful of mint. 5-year-olds were not easy to argue with, Fred thought. Max had a sweep of dirt encrusted on his cheek, and his eyebrows turned up on the corners. It gave his face a mischievous tilt. Fred hooked his finger into Max's shirt collar to steer him from thorns and what looked like rabbit droppings. The ground was mossy, speckled with patches of grass and creeper. One of the trees had scarlet flowers that had fallen and red carpeted on the forest floor. Sitting among the flowers under the bright white sun, Leela and Con were arguing. "You, boy, what's your name?" "Fred," called Con. "Come and tell this girl she's completely wrong." "She thinks," began Leela, flushing. "Obviously I think we should go back and wait near the plane," said Con, "in case they see it from the air, so they can rescue us." "It makes no sense," said Leela. She pulled her knees up to her chin. "We'd just get lost trying to find our way back, and I don't think anyone will see the plane. They don't know where we crashed. They'll have to search the entire jungle. We're on our own." She fixed her eyes on the dandelion-like plant, fierce and unblinking. "We'll have to find a way back to Manus ourselves." Fred looked at the girl properly. She had a scratch across the side of her narrow face, and her woven hair was tied into 2 dark plaits, one of which had been charred in the crash. She wore a scarlet skirt and blood-red top, both now stained grey. She looked about his age. She was scowling at Con. Con glared back. "That is crazy. We need to stay near the plane and wait to be rescued. My family will have sent dozens of planes in search of us by now. 100 planes, probably." "But," said Leela, "where we crashed is burnt by the fire. Half the trees are charcoal, and so there'll be no animals there." "We don't need to make animal friends. This isn't a fairy tale." "No, silly, for us to eat. And back there's—" "What?" said Con. "There's the pilot." "He's dead," said Con. "He can't hurt us." Leela spoke very quietly, but Fred was surprised by how authoritative she sounded. "We should make camp here." "No," said Con. "That's completely illogical." "Fred," asked Leela, "you get the deciding vote." "No, he doesn't," said Con. "That's not fair. One person shouldn't get to decide, not unless he agrees with me." Fred looked around the clearing again. The air was fresh here, and the sky above them a blue that does not exist in England. He was just about to answer when he saw that at the far end, where the forest grew thicker and tangled, 4 trees had fallen together, their tops meeting at a point. The very tips of the hairs on the back of Fred's neck began to rise. "Do you think there's anything odd about this clearing?" he said. "That's not an answer to the question," said Con. "Why?" asked Leela. "Those trees," he said. "Over there," he pointed. "What about them? They fell over. That's what trees do." "But they don't look like they fell to me." He ran across to the clearing. A sense was rising in him that something was strange. His curiosity pushed aside his fear. The largest of the trees was immense. Its trunk was as thick and tall as Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. 3 smaller trees leant against the thicker one. Each had grown a few feet from the next in a rough square, their branches entwined and darkened by green creepers. "Leave it alone, Fred," called Con. "Stay in the open." "There's something odd here." He ran his hand down one of the smaller trees. At the base was a mess of fern-like plants and a few mushrooms. He pushed the ferns down and felt his stomach swoop. The 3 smaller trees didn't have roots. They were logs, 15 feet high, each carefully tipped against the central tree. He could see where they'd been hacked with an axe or a machete. Ferns had grown, or been planted, Fred thought, at the bases, disguising the places where the cuts showed. "A den," breathed Fred. "What did you say?" called Con. Fred pushed at the vines that stretched between each of the logs. "It's like a tent," said Fred. "A den." He bent down, ready to push past the foliage. "No, don't go in there," said Con. It came out in a burst. "It's not that I'm scared, but please don't. It's not a reasonable risk." Fred stared at her. "Oh, what?" He had never in his life considered whether a risk was reasonable. It sounded like something his headmaster would say. "There could be anything in there, jaguars or snakes or even rats," said Con. "I can't not look," said Fred, astonished. "She might be right, though," said Leela. "About the snakes. Be careful." "I'll look," said Max grandly, jumping to his feet. "No, you absolutely won't," said Leela, grabbing his wrist. "You're staying right here." Fred pushed aside the vines hanging down between the logs. "Atch!" He winced. Some of the tendrils had tiny but vicious thorns, and they'd caught in one of his cuts. He brushed away another handful of vines and froze. His heart, which hadn't stopped double beating since the crash, quickened to triple speed. The trees met to make a tent, high enough for a man to kneel in, or for someone Max's height to stand. The air smelt deep green, and there was a spider web in one corner, and below it was a pile of banana leaves, stacked a dozen leaves thick in the shape of a sleeping mat. They had been almost entirely devoured by ants. Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. "Whoa, come and look at this," he called. The space between the 4 tree trunks had once covered in a roof and platted palm leaves. He reached up and touched them. The palms were riddled with holes, half rotted, and the light shone through, but he could see how intricately they'd been woven. He crawled further in, slowly looking for snakes in the green light. The ground squelched under his hands, and in the far corner of the den was a hollow gourd, rotten with mildew. Fred touched it gingerly. It was mulchy. He turned it upside down, wrinkling his nose at the smell. A cascade of flints splint out. Half had been chipped into the shape of arrowheads, others were square and squat, large as a fist. "You two!" He crawled backwards and stuck his head through the vines. "Come in, quick! You have to see this. Someone was here." "You're crazy," spat Con. If someone was here, they won't want us trespassing. I've had enough of this." She turned and began to march back into the trees. "Wait, Con, we shouldn't split up," called Fred. Infuriated, he scrambled out of the den and ran after her. "Whose house is it?" She turned to face him. Fred was startled. There were tears in her eyes. "You don't know, do you?" "Of course I don't," said Fred. "But I just think, what if they come back? I've read about it." Con hesitated, casting around for an idea. "Goldilocks. I know how it ends. I'm not going to be eaten." "I'm pretty sure this place wasn't built by bears," said Fred. "It could be cannibals." "Cannibals are mostly a myth," said Leila. "Says who?" "Everyone. Scientists. Our Mama and Papa." "And how do they know?" "Mama grew up in the jungle, near the Solimoes River, and she's a scientist, a botanist." "A botanist?" said Max. Con scowled at him, the nerves in her face twitching. "You overrate the width of the word bottom." Leila put a protective arm around Max and went on as if she'd been interrupted. "And our Papa's English, and he studies the plants of the jungle for medicine, and our mother was a scientist's assistant. We were supposed to be going to visit her in England. We were going to get the boat from Manus. She wanted to meet us before she died. She wanted to see what Max was like." Con snorted. Perhaps it's just as well we crashed." Leila ignored that. "Listen, whoever lives here, if they come back, might be able to take us to Manus." "Or they could eat us for dinner," said Con. She stared from Leila to Fred, angry and bewildered. "Just come inside," said Fred. "You'll see, nobody's been here for ages." Grudgingly, very slowly, Con turned around. She bent down and edged into the shelter. Leila and Max followed. Fred pulled at the rotten leaves lining the roof. "We could weave new leaves from the ceiling," he said, "and make new beds. Then it would smell less like a sock." He began gathering armfuls of half-decomposed foliage and pushing it outside. Underneath, the earth was soft and dusty. It smelt of 1,000 warm days, layered one over another. Leila brought in an armful of leaves, each as big as a pillowcase. She began to lay them down for beds. "And we could hang some extra vines over the front of the den," said Fred, "so nothing can see us." Con crouched in the shelter with her arms crossed. "Who died and made you king?" she said. "Nobody," Fred said, turned round startled. "But if we're going to sleep here, we might as well make it waterproof." "I'm not sleeping here," said Con. "Someone could come back here any second." "But they won't," said Fred. "Did you see those flints?" "Yes." "They're covered in moss." "So they're dirty. Fine. How is that supposed to be reassuring?" said Con. "He means they're old," said Leila. "It's deserted." "But why do you want to risk it?" said Con. "What if they do come back and think we're intruders?" "Or what if they're never coming back and they've left behind this shelter?" said Leila. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was a toughness to it. "If someone was here, that means someone else thought it was a good place to rest. It means it's safe." "But you cannot know for sure." "But we can't know anything for sure," said Fred. "Leila's right. As soon as we work out how to get out of here, we'll leave. But until then, it makes sense to stay in a place where other people have been." "Unless they eat us," said Con.
I'm staying here, said Max. I want to live in a tree tent, and if you try to make me move, I'll do a wee on you. No, you will not. Con backed away, smacking her head on a tree trunk. He does sometimes do that, said Leela, which for a moment Elise more or less settled in. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. So we've obviously found out that they've now found a den. They found a tree, like a tree house type idea. So they're all there ready to take some sleep and take some safety as well. Okay, so you'll have to tune in tomorrow's episode when we go through and we have a look at what is going to happen next. The next episode is called The River, so we will find out what is going to happen then.